We're very pleased this morning to have Rabbi Benjamin Lefkowitz as our speaker. As you may know, the Multicultural Committee tries to cover a multitude of topics related to that area we call multiculturalism. And that deals with ethnicity, religion, everything else in between. This morning, actually, I'm glad we have the class just coming up. This morning, one of the areas that we wanted to cover last couple of years was on Judaism, and we're very happy that Rabbi Lefkowitz has agreed to talk with us about that, which is a subject which I think many people are sort of aware of, but a lot of the details, I think my experience, I teach history here, most students here, and even maybe faculty, are not aware of the of Judaism in terms of its complexities, origins, and its different manifestations, etc. So I'm sure we're going to be enlightened by Rabbi Lefkowitz, setting him up here.
I'm a rabbi, I'm not Hobbes and Locke. Go ahead. I'll look it up later.
Right. Anyway, Rabbi Lefkowitz is currently a rabbi in a congregation in Hull, which is, some of you may know, is somewhere on the South Shore, I believe.
Yeah. It's the peninsula that forms the bottom of the entrance of Boston Harbor. It's a beach community. Smile Nicely, my temple has a parking lot 2 blocks from the ocean.
Wow. On the other hand, he lives in Warwick, Rhode Island, so he covers a lot of territory. And he's also an adjunct professor here at Bristol Community College, at Bridgewater State University.
That's many years ago.
Oh, many years
ago.
Before you were born. Before I was born, way before I was born. Has been. Roger Williams University.
Has been.
Okay. And let's see, Stony Hill College, Rhode Island College. So he's taught in a number of places, including here. So he's well aware of our students, and I know from talking to some of the students who come to the tutoring center, they have very high opinion of him. So we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So,
thank you. It's funny, I keep lecture notes and eulogies on the same kind of 5x8 card. And I thank you all for the invitation. When Mrs. Sadler and I were first discussing my coming, we were talking about what I would talk about. And some of the questions that were raised were things like, what makes a person Jewish? Some of the aspects of commandment, and so on. Views of God. And I thought, rather than my just spewing, let me ask you a question. I just want you to fill in the blank. Okay? A Jew is a person who? A Jew is a person who? Anybody want to volunteer an answer? Yes?
Believes in one God.
Okay, that's a start. Belief in one God. It is a monotheistic faith. What else? Anybody else want to venture a guess? Yes?
Sometimes it's cited as an ethnic or racial heritage, even down to genetics, and other times it's more about observance, at least, of some of the commandments of Torah.
Correct. Nice to see you again. Anybody else? Yes?
Some of the traces is biblical ancestry to Abraham.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else want to venture a guess? You're not being graded, so don't worry. Students are so worried about grades all the time.
Well, if we're going to trace it to Abraham, we've got to get more specific, because Abraham is also the father of Hagar. Or no, Hagar is the
she's his
mother of
concubine.
Ishmael. Yes.
Right, and he is the father of Ishmael. And actually, many scholars refer to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the Abrahamic religions, because they all do trace their lineage in one way or another back to Abraham, who at some point is considered to be the father of monotheism, although modern critical scholarship questions whether it was a pure monotheism at the time, but that's a different course. Actually, all of and working with him one year, Morris Kurtzer deliberately titled his introduction to Judaism book, "What is a Jew?" so as to avoid that specific conundrum of who is a Jew. The analogy I like to use in terms of being Jewish is an American citizen. Aside from the fact that the colonial ancestors were very Bible conscious, there are actually some who suggested that Hebrew be the national language, which would have made my job an awful lot easier. And they actually wanted to make the Great Seal a picture of the people of Israel crossing the sea with the Pharaoh's army being drowned by Charlton Heston, of course. Those of you who haven't seen the movie, just forget it. That we're dating ourselves, aren't we? Okay? Anyway, there is an element of that, because as a citizen, you have certain rights, you have certain obligations. And you can become a citizen of the United States how? Yes, okay.
By being born here.
You are born here, or you go through a process of naturalization. And one becomes a Jew by birth, or through what we call, for lack of a better word, conversion, or what some people choose to be called a Jew by choice is the more neutral term now. And I have worked with people of both. I am a Jew by birth. Both my parents happen to have been Jewish. I have friends and congregants who have studied with me and gone through the rituals that are required for conversion to Judaism. But it involves, so in the sense of an ethnic background, there is that sense of nationality as well, but any nationality, or as the late Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, called it, Judaism as a civilization. And what are the elements of a civilization? Western Civ. What does it take to be, yes?
For civilization to be made, it needs 1, a history,
Yeah,
2, a land,
correct.
and 3, basic religion.
Okay, some form of religious observance, or accepted groups of religious observance. There are more. Those are good foundations. Other things.
Economy.
What?
And an economy as well.
An economy. Yes.
Back in
It needs a culture.
A what?
It needs a culture.
Yes, it needs a culture of some kind. Yes.
Government.
A government. And the laws to go with it. And a governing body, or set up an authority system in one way or another. Something else.
Division of labor, food surplus, cities, that was what we got in 6th grade.
Okay. Yeah, I went to school at the same time as Gilgamesh also, so. A common language, which for Jews is Hebrew. There are other languages that Jews around the world have spoken. Judeo-Spanish dialect from the Middle Ages, better known as Ladino, which is still spoken actually in places like Turkey and Greece and some of the Balkan areas, although a good deal of that population was wiped out during World War II, during the Holocaust, in Greece and the Balkans. I've had a couple of professors who spoke Ladino at home with their families. And there was actually a Judeo-Persian dialect, a Judeo-Arabic dialect. The one we are most familiar with here is called Yiddish, which comes from originally a medieval German dialect, which then had Hebrew and Slavic words added to it. And you're probably familiar with some Yiddish words, but I won't use them because actually they're very impolite, in spite of the fact that people use them in current parlance and just don't know what they really mean. anatomical references. Okay? Jackie Mason uses them all the time. He's actually a distant cousin, but I try to hide all the time. But Judaism has all of these things. A common religion. Also, something else that civilization generally has is certain days of observance. Certain days that are considered special in the calendar. Okay? In American civilization, think of the secular holidays we have, or the ones that we've turned into secular holidays. But even some, President's Day. How many of us remember when it was Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday? Okay? You're all older than you look. There's, July 4th, Thanksgiving, although it started off as a religious observance. There are probably a couple of others I'm not thinking of at the moment, but there are certain days that are considered special in the calendar, generally of some kind of historical significance. And in fact, when you look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all do. They all have certain days that are considered holy, and they generally reflect some sort of event within the life of that faith community or religious community, or in the case of the Jewish people, it's exactly the term we use. There's a sense of peoplehood, which Rabbi Kaplan, Mordecai Kaplan, used extensively in his writings. So there's a mixture. On the one hand, yes, Judaism has a religious component, monotheism, certain religious holy days, and so on. Life cycle ceremonies, something that all religions have in common. They may not be the same or at the same time, but all religions sooner or later are going to mark significant life events. One of my students at Stonehill years ago said there was something else Judaism and Christianity had in common. Bingo. Again, that's from before many people's time. And they all together, by the way, at one time or another classically had a concept of salvation. That observing certain rituals, certain practices, certain holy days would help lead one into a better life in another world after death. How those concepts played out and the extent to which they played out differ from religion to religion. But they all have what they might call a salvationary system in what they do. They all have something else. That they are born out of originally what the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called radical amazement. It's a wonderful term. If you ever get a chance to read any of Heschel, particularly his book called The Sabbath. It's barely 100 pages long, but Heschel had a magnificently beautiful, clear, very poetic writing style, and his own background is as a Holocaust refugee who came to this country, first to Cincinnati, then settled in New York, and was not only a learned scholar and brilliant thinker, but was also a social activist and who marched side by side with Reverend Martin Luther King in a number of the marches in the civil rights era. And in fact, all of the Abrahamic religions also tend to be socially activist in one way or another. That there's this concept of bringing about a better world and that one must be involved in it. In Hebrew, there's an expression, tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. And it goes back to rabbinic interpretations of the creation story. And the Jewish understanding is that God left the world imperfect, not quite finished. After all, God takes how many days? 6 days, and what does God do on the 7th day?
Rest.
No. The Hebrew word doesn't say rest. Why wouldn't you say rest about God?
Because the job's always going on.
Well, job's going on, something else. Does God get tired? She does listening to me. That's besides the point. Okay? But God doesn't get tired, but God stops creating after that 6th day. That's actually what the Hebrew says. The word for Sabbath is Shabbat, which comes from a Hebrew word meaning to stop doing what you're doing. Okay, rather, and it's related actually to a word meaning to sit down or to settle. So no, God stops. Well, there's still things that have to be done, and that's up to human beings to do. And that's part of what we call in Hebrew the brit, the covenant. What's a covenant? It's more than an agreement. What's a covenant? Yes?
A promise.
It's more than a promise. It is a promise, it is an agreement, but more.
Obligation.
It's an obligation of what type? Yes?
Contract.
It's a contract. And in Jewish concept, there is a contract between God and the people of Israel. When is it established? How many of you have ever seen History of the World Part 1?
When Moses comes down from
With 15
Mount
books,
Sinai.
sorry, 10 commandments. Okay? When those commandments are given at Sinai, and actually, according to Jewish tradition, it wasn't just those 10. I'll come back to that. A contract is established. Moses carries down how many plaques of stone? Yeah, why 2? No, no, that's Mel Brooks. Thank you. You've seen, okay? Why would you have two tablets with the commandments on them? Yeah.
There's 2 different sets of commandments, those that relate directly to God and those that relate to mankind.
There's a traditional explanation that the first 5 commandments, in one way or another, explain the relationship between God and the people, and the other 5 are relations between the people and each other. In fact, if you play with that, it doesn't quite work that way, because honoring your parents, I would think, is as much a human-related as the other. And coveting, which is the 10th commandment, really doesn't relate to anyone else, unless you've read Thomas Hobbes, who really is very conscious of those 10 commandments in his writing. Because what does Thomas Hobbes say? Any of you study Hobbes at all? Besides the fact that he's a stuffed tiger?
The social contract that we
Right, but that's not what I'm getting at.
Okay.
Why does Hobbes say we need to make a contract with each other and put a government in place? Yeah.
Wasn't he the one that claimed that humans were naturally wicked and a government was needed to keep them alive?
To quote the late St. George of Carlin, we all want each other's stuff. Okay? Yes, we are by nature acquisitive. Okay, and what does Hobbes say? We fight because we all want the same thing. That's what coveting is about, is wanting what somebody else has. The actual reason for 2 tablets? It's a contract. You sign a contract. 2 copies, 1 for each party. And it was going to be kept in the Ark of the Covenant. A later English word for covenant is testament, which is how you get the expressions Old Testament, New Testament. Okay? And there were issues in Christian theology at one time of a new covenant being established with the coming of Christianity, replacing and superseding the one God previously had with the Jewish people. So that's how you get that concept of Old Testament, New Testament. But there is this concept of covenant. And Jews are ones who are, in one way or another, people who adhere to that covenant, either by birth or by choice. How much they observe, similar to Christianity and Islam, Judaism is not monolithic. There are any number of movements, and some of those movements are fragmented. In terms of the most strict observance of the law of the Talmud, which is a several million word expansion and commentary on Scripture, on what Christians would call Old Testament and what Jews call Tanakh. The Talmud, which contains laws and legends and ethics and stories, and it's clear too at times the rabbis had a wonderfully delicious sense of humor. The Orthodox movements, including the Hasidim, who represent something of the mystical wing of Judaism, they are the most strict in observing those rules and in seeing them all as having been given at Sinai. The Reform movement, which started a little over 200 years ago in Germany, made the break and felt that it was appropriate to either abrogate or amend certain aspects of the law that they felt were no longer applicable in a modern society. The conservative movement arose as a middle-of-the-way movement. Yes, we will make changes, but we will have a standard method and approach to making those changes. And the conservative movement actually has a committee of rabbis detailed with the task of adjudicating potential changes in Jewish practice to meet those needs. But it's, whereas in Reform and even in the Reconstructionist, which is a smaller movement, the changes tend to be more on an individual autonomy basis. So there are these different movements, and even within those movements there can be differences of opinion. So people can, and there are many Jews, half the Jews in this country do not affiliate with synagogues at all. Some affiliate with Jewish community centers or cultural groups, or they are affiliated with one of the Zionist groups or scholarly groups. There are any number of ways. We even go so far as to say that there are Jews who are what we call gastronomic Jews. They eat bagels and lox and blintzes a lot, and gefilte fish, which is definitely an acquired taste. Some, we even used to refer to them as cardiac Jews. Why? Because they feel it in their heart. Okay? I remember once I gave a sermon about that, and this man who never came to synagogue, but he was attending a bat mitzvah, came running up, and he stuck his finger right in my face and says, "Don't you ever call me a cardiac Jew." And I just looked at him and said, he's no longer alive, sadly. "Harry, was I talking about you?" So there are all these different aspects to being a Jew. And we've only just scratched the surface on that. A mitzvah.
Is that a blessing?
No, it's not a blessing.
A good deed?
It's very often used to mean a good deed. It means something else. Anybody? Yeah.
Well, a good deed that is part of the 613 good deeds in the contract.
Okay. You don't have good deeds in a contract. You have stipulations. What's the old joke? Moses and the 10 strong suggestions. I have a book on my shelf in my office. It's called Politically Correct Tales from the Old Testament. Pardon me. And literally it means a commandment, that these are things one is obligated to do. So how does the word mitzvah become a good deed? Because good deeds are required. They are not something you do because you think you're a nice person or it's someone you happen to like. In fact, there are several commandments that specifically state you have to do things for people you don't like. Okay? And the classic one is, if you come across someone you can't stand, whose animal has fallen down under its burden, you must help that person get the animal up on its feet again. Why? Why? Yeah.
Back in the history of the early days of Jews, it was an agricultural country.
Yeah.
Their animal, their beast of burden, whether it was a horse or a bull or whatever, was their livelihood. It helped them to plow the fields. It was how they were able to succeed. So if you did not help them, you're actually wishing them a death sentence.
Yeah. Something else.
Salvation?
Oh, okay, it's part of the salvationary system. Something else. Yeah, I saw some hand. Yeah.
To basically, it's to help your neighbor, to help the one, even if you don't like them, it is still, if you don't help someone, you besmirch them. And by besmirching them, you besmirch yourself by denying them help.
Right. Refusing to help refusing to help a person in need belittles you. It also is something else. Maybe if you stop to help this person that hates you and you think he's a shtunk, you can figure out what that Yiddish is. Yes? You may repair relationships. Let me do a footnote. only like Homer, my footnotes tend to be epic similes. An eye for an eye is a misunderstanding of the biblical text. Yes, it says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But as opposed to the Hammurabi Code from Babylonia, which predates Moses by about 500 years, the context is clearly financial compensation. It's in Exodus 22 where, interestingly enough, the passage first appears in context with, if men are fighting and one of them hits a woman who is carrying a child and she miscarries, the penalty for that is a fine to the woman and her husband. It is not a death sentence. It's not considered murder. And then it goes on to say that's if she loses the pregnancy, you pay a fine. If, however, she suffers further harm, then the penalty increases. If she dies from it, now it's a murder. And then it goes on to say, and then you compensate, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, meaning you pay the fine commensurate with the severity of the injury. Okay? It is not literal mutilation, because the rabbis in the Talmud discussing this came up with a lovely metaphor, or rather analogy. Suppose you have somebody, well, let's take Polyphemus. Who was Polyphemus? Yeah?
Was the Cyclops.
The Cyclops. He's got one eye. Suppose he knocks out the eye of somebody who has two good eyes. What do you do to him? Besides remind his father Poseidon that you really don't want to wander another 10 years after Troy? You can look that one up too.
Book 9.
Yes. No. Do you knock out Polyphemus's eye because he knocked out the eye of somebody who has two eyes? Is that equitable and fair? Is that justice? No, it's not, because you've blinded him now. The other person isn't blind. So what do? He has to compensate that person for the loss of the eye, for the pain and suffering, for the loss of wages, and so on. And in fact, the book of Exodus even says, if you injure somebody, you have to compensate them for loss of wages, plus the pain and suffering, and so on. In other words, personal injury lawyers were already there. Okay? By the way, I've got 5 lawyers in my immediate family. Don't ever try to. My daughter, her husband, my wife's sister, her husband, their daughter. And my father practiced law for 60 years. Sue me. Okay? So it's not literally eye for eye. But a mitzvah is a good deed that is commanded. Charity in Jewish practice is called Sedaka Righteousness. It's something that's the right thing to do, not because you feel inclined or because you may like the people or you may feel bad for them, but you're obligated. Whether you want to or not, there's a certain amount that you'd be expected to do. The thing is, a mitzvah becomes the concept of a good deed because it's said that way. And according to tradition, there are 613 commandments, all of which were given to Moses at Sinai. You think he was up there 40 days and 40 nights for 10 sentences? If so, we got to send him back to writing 101, right? Okay. Note 613 commandments. And the rabbis of the Talmud, it's something of a homiletic interpretation. They're trying to make a point. The 613, if you do some math with it, breaks down to 365 and 248. What does the number 365 signify? Days of the year. 248?
A power of 2.
No. How many of you have done some anatomy courses? Yeah. How many bones are there in the human body? 206. Add some of the other organs. The rabbis understood that the total number of organs in the body, or parts of the body, added up to 248. So you got days of the year, parts of the body. What's the message behind the message? Yeah, something else. That you should be observing the commandments all the time, every day, and that all of you is involved in this, physically and spiritually. Now, of those 613, many of them don't apply today anymore. Quite a few of them had to do with animal sacrifices that took place in the temple in Jerusalem, which stood roughly where the Dome of the Rock now stands, on the Temple Mount, the Haram HaSharif. Those don't apply. That was the only place where it was legitimate to observe and perform sacrifices. Many of the others are agricultural. You were talking about there being an agricultural society. There were laws of tithing, laws of how soon you could use the fruit from a new fruit tree that had just been planted. The commandment that when you harvested, you could not glean your harvest, and in fact had to leave one corner of the field or the corners of your fields unharvested so that the poor and the landless could come and obtain some kind of sustenance. Yes?
That's what we learned about with Ruth and Naomi.
That's exactly the story of Ruth and Naomi, okay? Where she is allowed to glean. That was a real practice. There is the law that every 7th year the land must be allowed to lie fallow. That's where we get the idea of a sabbatical year. That the land belongs to God, that nothing ultimately belongs to us. And also there's the so-called Jubilee year, every 50th year, where according to tradition, the land returned to the original family of ownership. Because if the land is a gift from God, you can't alienate a gift that God has given you, which is a nice moral lesson as well. But no, it would return. Those apply only in the land of Israel itself. You're left with 300 and some others, and some of them are things I've mentioned already. Helping up. Oh, there's one more thing about helping the animal up. We've been focusing on the people. What about the animal that's fallen down and has this weight on there? Okay? Help the animal up. There's a concept in Judaism, tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, being conscious of the fact that living creatures suffer as well. And even the Jewish dietary laws reflect that in terms of the way that meat has to be slaughtered and processed afterwards to remove the blood. We are allowed to take the life, but not to consume the soul, which is considered tied to the blood. Yes?
There's a question about that.
Yeah.
Does that mean that people in the Jewish community believe that an animal has a soul?
There is that concept. The biblical statement says that the nefesh of the animal, the soul of the animal, is in the blood. And that has to be removed from the meat before you can eat it. Consuming blood is expressly forbidden, from a Jewish perspective, not only to Jews, but to humanity as a whole. Besides the covenant with the Jewish people, there is this concept that God had a covenant with all humanity. There are 7 commandments of the children of Noah that were given by God to Noah after the flood. And God even says that I'm putting a sign of this covenant in the sky, namely the story of the rainbow. And those 7 commandments are not participating in, in immoral, idolatrous practices, taking innocent life. There's a prohibition against sexual offenses. The others, you cannot tear flesh from a living animal, or by extension being cruel to animals, or consume the blood. You cannot be a blasphemer. You cannot take something that doesn't belong to you. No theft of any kind, of persons or property. And the last of the 7 is you can't take the law into your own hands. You have to support a society that has fair, just, and equitable laws. And from the Jewish perspective, any non-Jew who observes those 7 is as righteous as any Jew who observes 613. Among the other 613, you find a lost object. You have to make an effort to return it to its owner. You can't, it's not finders keepers, losers weepers. At a certain point it becomes yours, but only after you've made a reasonable effort. And there's a story of one of the ancient rabbis who found a bushel of grain that had been dropped by someone, carrying a big load. They didn't even realize it. He wasn't able to catch up to them. He finds this bushel of grain. And what did he do? He took a separate field, planted the grain, and he continued to harvest and store and reharvest that grain year by year. And several years later, and either he stored it or he sold it. Several years later, the owner of that original bushel of grain happened to come by and that came up in conversation, and the rabbi said to the owner, "Oh, here's your bushel of grain." He showed him the active grain field and all the money that had been made over the years from selling the grain. Okay, that goes to something of an extreme, but it shows the ethic behind it. Okay, so you have, yes, the commandments that deal with dietary laws and with holy days and life cycle events and rituals and so on, but there are also all these ethical commandments. And in addition, the 613 commandments contain what we would understand to be civil and criminal law. Laws of theft, laws of assault, torts, for those of you that are doing legal studies, and so on. Those are all part of it. And in fact, the Talmud is in 6 major sections, then broken down further. One of those 6 major sections deals expressly with civil and criminal law based on the laws we find in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. How many of you have ever seen Schindler's List? Okay, remember the inscription on the tombstone? When they're putting stones on his grave, whoever saves one life is as if he had saved the entire world. Okay, that comes from a passage in the Talmud that is actually a series of instructions given to witnesses in a capital case where somebody could be facing capital punishment. And they say to this person, before you testify, only one human being was created at first. And in fact, the human being's name wasn't Adam. The word Adam means human being in Hebrew. Why only one human being? So that no one can say to anyone else, my ancestors are superior to yours. So that everyone has the right to say, the world was created for my sake. Okay? To show that, you know, God's not like a human being. A human being stamps out coins, they all look the same. God stamps out all these from one image of God, and we're all different. And then they say, whoever takes a single life is as if he had destroyed the entire world. Whoever saves a single life is as if he had saved an entire world. Now imagine you're going to testify in a case where someone's life could be lost. That places a tremendous moral and ethical burden on someone who takes it seriously. So you have all these commandments that range all over the place. A rabbi by the name of Samuel S. Cohen once wrote a book, Judaism, A Way of Life. And that fits very well also, considering how far and wide all this thing comes together. Something else. Another question. How am I doing on time? Because there's no clock there. Oh, good.
About 20
Yeah.
minutes.
But,
About 20 minutes.
okay, but I'm here and the clock is there, so. Here's a fill in the blank. God. Yes. Powerful. Love. Yes.
Is the infinite divine energy that runs within the universe, and our primitive minds cannot grasp what God is or isn't. It is an unsexed being, which many has many faces and appears to different people as different things.
Which seminary did you go to?
That's something my dad came up with.
Oh, okay. That works. By the way, one of my favorite bumper stickers, and I've only seen it once. It's sort of like a white buffalo. You see it once in your lifetime. And I have seen a white buffalo. Didn't do me any good. I just almost went off the Interstate 80 when I saw it. God's last name is not damn it. Okay? And those of you who know the Bill Cosby routine about his mother and what she used to scream at the kids. What else? Creator.
Merciful.
Merciful. Love and loving. Mm-hmm. Forgiving. Merciful. When Moses encounters God on Mount Sinai and says to God, I want to see you straight up. God says, nobody can and live. So God says, I'm going to put you here in a little cleft, a little bit of a cave, And I'm going to come by, and I'm going to put my hand over you. Notice the anthropomorphism in many of these stories. And you can see me from behind. I mean, there's a great Gary Larson cartoon waiting to happen in that one. And so Moses is there, God passes by, and she puts her hand over him. Just wanted to see the reaction. Okay, but if God, who says God is either gender, could be, if we are made in God's image, and half of us in this world or more happen to be of the feminine persuasion, what is to say that God couldn't be? Okay, even Moses doesn't see God directly, face to face. None of us knows. So we can come up with all kinds of words for God. The more important thing is, how do we relate to God? Mordecai Kaplan actually, and it was a very radical statement at the time, said God is the power that makes for salvation in the universe. So, and because that's so multivalent, you could go any number of places with it. The question is, how do we relate to God? In Judaism, yes?
Depending on your different religion is whatever way you need to connect to your Lord, Master, whatever you want to call the great divine. For some, it is through enlightenment. Others, it is through daily practices. And for some, it could be even, we're just working in a garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you tap into that infinite energy, as I call it.
In Genesis 2, it says that God planted a garden in Eden, which is an actual place. It was an area near in Sumeria that was known to be very fertile, Edinu. We're put here to till and to be guardians of, and not owners of, but guardians of creation and tillers of creation. Okay? We relate to God any number of ways. First of all, in Judaism, and this is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and it is recited twice daily, morning and evening. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal is one. God is sole, singular, and unique. And one of the things that I've encountered Christians at various times who can't understand why Judaism doesn't accept the Trinity. Okay? That's one of the places where Judaism and Islam are on one side, Christianity on the other, is that tripartite God. Although even within Christianity, there are different understandings of the Trinity. But God is one and unique. And you go from there. And then the very next verse says, you shall love the eternal, your God, with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. The relationship with God is one of love. One of the things that at times had popped up in Christian theology goes back to a heretic named Marcion in the 2nd century who proposed that there were actually two gods, the God of the Old Testament being a God of law and justice and war, and the God of the New Testament being one of love. And I remember as a kid, some of the kids on my block who were Christian saying that to me. Your God is a God of this, and our God is a God of love and mercy, and so on. When Moses, however, encounters God and God passes by, the voice says, the eternal, a God long-suffering, patient, and forgiving. So it shows up sooner or later in all religions that there is a God who at times may be judging, but who is ultimately forgiving. Okay? But how do we relate to God? In part out of love. How does that love manifest itself? If God is the ultimate divine parent, what is a parent's job with a child? To raise, to nurture, but what? To give guidelines, to set the boundaries, to teach that child about the right way to live. And sooner or later, every religion has as its basis, this is the right way to live. That's a common concept. How they work it out can differ from religion to religion. The devil is in the details. But God shows love by giving the guidance, by giving the commandments. This is the way to live. That the way to freedom is not anarchy, which is again what Hobbes is talking about, but rather we have a set of rules that liberates us and protects our right to be ourselves. God loves us, and our response is, how do you show your love for your parents? Through respect. Honor your father and mother, okay? That while you are still under their tutelage, you show respect and love by following what they say. Yeah, until you're about 13 or 14, but that's besides the point, okay? But that's the way, it's a mutual love, but in a marriage, right? Are there not, in theory, rules, boundaries, guidelines? We respond to each other by way of mutual respect. When you're married to someone, you just don't go off and do whatever you want, totally ignoring the feelings or needs or wants of your partner. So it's a love in that way. There's a contract from our point of view, and there's something else. We are very free agents in many ways. And in Judaism, one of the things we do a lot is argue with God. And we don't have to worry about walking out in a thunderstorm afterwards. I can't tell you the number of times that I've worked with people who have suffered a terrible bereavement, and they're terribly angry with God. And they hold it in because they're afraid that will make God angrier. You know, it's the old theology of something bad happened to me because I did something bad, or God is testing me. If you look at Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People, he challenges that theology. So does Rabbi Milton Steinberg in a brilliant novel called As a Driven Leaf, which is about a man's search for faith and certainty and the challenges that he faces. It's based on characters from the 2nd century, real historical characters who appear in the Talmud and some of the other rabbinic literature. And it's one of the reasons I never finished my dissertation. I was busy reading it and rereading it. But we challenge God. And I tell people it's okay to be angry with God. If in a love relationship, we do at times get angry with each other. And it's okay to say, I'm angry. Okay, if God as a loving God will accept that, just as we at times, although we don't like it, come to accept the fact that we've done something wrong or we've incurred the anger of a partner. But people challenge God. There's a story in Genesis where God is about to go down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, if Abraham is going to bring word of me to the world, he has to know what's going on. And God says, I'm going to wipe them out. And Abraham, what does Abraham do?
He talks him back and forth about if there are 50, if there's 40, if there's 30, there's 10, and God says he would save them each time.
Right. Abraham says to God, literally, he says, you can't do that. And God goes, what do you mean? I'm God. Abraham says, no, of all people, you are the last one who can do that. You are the last one who can destroy the innocent with the guilty. And maybe the most important theological statement in the entire Tanakh is what Abraham then says. And it's the major break between Judaism in its origins and the pagan world. The judge of all the earth must act justly. You cannot be capricious. You cannot be unforgiving. You cannot be callous or unfair, because if you are, then everybody else has the right to be. You can't set the rules and then break them yourself. And then Abraham says, what if there are 50 righteous people? He's actually bargaining about 5 cities here. So 10 in each city. Okay, what about 1 missing from each city? What about 45? And they bargain, and when they get down to 10, Abraham gets the clear message from God. You can tell from tone of voice. Okay? I just wish once the voice of God in a movie would be a soprano. Okay, enough. But there's this challenge of God. Later on, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, alone one night, encounters some being. Is it an angel? Is it another person? Is it himself that he's wrestling with? Some people say God, and in fact, his name at that point is changed to Israel. And the being that he has wrestled with all night says, what is Israel? Because you have struggled with God and man and prevailed. And there's a book out called God Wrestling. I can't remember the name of the rabbi who wrote it. Job gets very angry with God. The patience of Job, he's not patient. He has suffered the loss in one day of his entire wealth and all 10 of his children and his 3 so-called friends. And with friends like these, you don't need enemies. They come to supposedly console him. And at one point, one of them actually says, your children died, maybe they did something to deserve it. At that point, I'm performing surgery on these guys with a sharp rock. And Job, in effect, demands God come down and go on trial. And ultimately, God does. And God's one of those people, though, at least in the book, doesn't come off well, because Job suffers this because of a bet God has with an angel known in Hebrew as Ha-Satan, the adversary. We later get the word Satan from that, but in fact, this angel's job is to test humans' faith. It is not a fallen angel, lord of evil, as we see in Milton. Okay? And at the end, Job is rewarded for challenging God. God doesn't actually apologize or explain it. God says, you don't know the way the world works. I created the world. This is beyond your knowledge. And, right, we've all gotten into arguments with people. You know, they do something and you correct them and they just intimidate the hell out of you, and you finally say, even though you know you're right, forget it, sorry, my fault. Okay? And then Job has all his wealth restored twice over. He and his wife are reunited, and they have 10 new children. And God says to the friends, beg Job to pray for you, because he did what was right and you were wrong. Well, what was wrong? They spouted the standard theology, you're suffering because you sinned. Whereas Job got mad and demanded an answer. Okay? There is the story of a Hasidic master, Levi Yitzchak, of the town of Berdichev, who at a time of terrible persecution, and that's a whole story in and of itself, and the history of anti-Semitism, maybe if I have a moment I'll be able to touch on some of it, that on the Jewish New Year, which is one of the most solemn days of the year, he opens the ark where the Torah scrolls are kept, and he says to God, you're the ruler of the universe. All the nations think they have kings. You're the king. But I got a question. What do you have against us? Yes, you have the power and the right to punish us for our sins, but we have not sinned to the point where you should be punishing us and we should be suffering this kind of persecution. And I am not going to move from this spot, says Levi Yitzchak, until you, God, change your ways. And then he begins to sing the Kaddish, which is a praise of God. And one of my favorite Talmudic stories, the rabbis are arguing, the Sanhedrin of 70 are arguing about a very abstruse point of ritual law. What it is not important. 69 of them say it's one way, and one, Eliezer, says, nope, 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 you're all wrong. And they can't convince him no matter what. They quote lines from Scripture, they use logic, nothing works. And he can't convince them, and finally he says, if I'm right, I want a tree to prove it. And a carob tree gets up and moves. It's practicing for Act 5 of Macbeth, for those of you that remember the story. Then he said, and they say, we don't learn the law from trees. Okay, I want the river to prove it. And the river just outside where they're meeting reverses course. No, we don't learn the law from rivers. All right, I want the walls of this room to prove it, and the walls start to tilt until another rabbi gets up and uses God's name to stop them. How dare you interfere with the sages? Okay, if I'm right, I want a voice from heaven to proclaim it. And this voice comes down out of the sky and says, why are you arguing with Eliezer? Don't you know he's always right in these matters? It reminds me of a story of the rabbi arguing with his board. They're all saying one thing, and the rabbi says, nope, 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 you're wrong. And the chairman says, sorry, you're outvoted. The rabbi says, God will testify for me, and a voice comes out of the sky. The rabbi's right. And the chairman says, okay, now it's 10-2. Okay? And at that point, a rabbi named Joshua stands up and says, in Deuteronomy, there's a verse that says, this law is not over the sea that you need to send someone over the sea to bring it back to you and explain it to you. It's not up in heaven that you need someone to go up into heaven and bring it down and explain it to you. It's in your own heart and in your own mouth. It's within you. And he quotes that verse. He says, no, the law's not up in heaven. We don't need to pay attention to this voice out of the sky. The law is here on earth. And we do it by majority rule. At that point, Eliezer is silenced. Legend has it, those of you who know the story of Elijah, that what happens to him at the end of his career?
He is taken up into heaven.
He's taken up into the sky in a flaming chariot, or maybe it was a Ford Pinto. For those of you who remember what used to happen to those cars. And anyway, so he's never died. So he's free to come back to earth, and there are certain rabbis who are so pious that they are understood as being able to encounter Elijah. And Rabbi Joshua encounters him. How you doing? What's, you know, and he says, tell me something. Where were you when they had that argument with Eliezer? And he says, I was with God. And the rabbi says, what did God do? And Elijah says, God looked down and smiled and said, my children got the best of me. And that, in a nutshell, kind of explains the, you know, the Jewish approach to God in that way. There's another story about that same rabbi, Joshua ben Levi, who encounters Elijah and says, it's miserable. The world is a mess. When is the Messiah going to come? And Elijah says, he's here. Where? He's over by the city gate. You'll find him with all the people who are poor and diseased at the city gate. How do I know him? Well, all the others unwrap all their bandages and then put new ones on. He does his one at a time because he never knows when the shofar, the ram's horn, is going to sound and he's going to be needed. So the rabbi goes to the city gate, finds the Messiah. He says, when are you coming? He says, today. Oh. Good, and he leaves. The day ends. He encounters Elijah again. He said, he lied to me. Elijah says, what do you mean? He said, I will come today. Oh, says Elijah, you missed the point. There's a verse in Psalms, today will I come if only you listen to my voice. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam also do have that salvationary sense of an ultimate perfect world. The word Messiah comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, someone who was anointed. In the ancient world, high priests and kings had special anointing oil poured over their heads. It's a sign of God's special blessing and favor. For those of you who were confirmed, what did the bishop do? What's part of the ceremony? Anoint you, right? The word Christ comes from the Greek meaning someone who's anointed, and the anointing oil is called chrism, correct? Okay? So that's where that word comes from. And they all have this sense of ultimately an end of history and a perfect world. Okay? I don't have time to go into all of the various holidays and so on. Any questions? And then if not, I'll touch on a little bit about anti-Semitism. Could someone ask me that by email? Yes?
I have a little question about Kabbalah and the 10 levels of mysticism.
That's another course for about 4 to 8 months. Kabbalah, you have the 10 sefirot, the 10 spheres, as it were. They're sort of emanations of God. Kabbalah is very complex. I'm not an expert in it, not by a long shot. And a good deal of what floats around now is popularized. Please forget it. Madonna and Britney just are not part of the real group. Kabbalah goes way back to some of the stories in Genesis of creation are used to explain a mystical experience. We have Elijah, we have in Ezekiel chapter 1, this very strange chapter about a divine chariot with beasts with different faces and wheels that have lights or jewels in them and turn every which way. There's a whole school of Kabbalah mysticism, literally means a received tradition, that deals with that. Kabbalah, in fact, you're not supposed to study Kabbalah until you are 40, married, and stable. I know how many of those I qualify for. Thank you. You have the one that's most familiar is the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in the town in Galilee called Safed, in the 1500s. and to a large extent was a response to the tragedy and the trauma of the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And again, it's a search for, ultimately, all religions try to answer a question of where do bad things come from? And how do we react to that? How do we explain tragedies and evil, which are two separate things? And it always galls me when someone says a mass murder is a tragedy. No, it's an act of evil. Okay, a tragedy is when it happened. A tragedy is what's happened to the people in eastern Turkey last night. Deliberately, there was a major earthquake. There are already hundreds identified as dead, probably more. Evil is when people deliberately cause it and abuse their free will to cause harm to others. So Kabbalah, Luria talked about the idea that at creation, the divine light was scattered and sparks fell to the earth, and the vessels in which that divine light was kept were shattered and fell to earth. And then he picks up on our concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, that we are partners with God, and that by observing the commandments and living righteous lives, we slowly but surely gather up the sparks and repair the vessels. And when all the sparks are gathered in and all the vessels are repaired, the Messiah will come. The 10 Sefirot represent different aspects of God. Some of them are masculine, some of them are feminine. So it's a very, very complex system, and I can't begin to explain it to you. There are a couple of books by a man named Berg, like Kabbalah for the layman. He's a source you can trust. And there's a book that was written by a Reform rabbi. I'm myself a Reform rabbi, a colleague of mine, older than I, called 9.5 Mystics. And I know the man, and I can't think of his name to save my life. Herbert Weiner, W-I-N-E-R, 9.5 Mystics, because it talks about his attempt to venture into the world of Kabbalah. There's a story in the Talmud. 4 rabbis entered the Pardes, the orchard. It's a code word. We don't know what it means. Akiba, the great martyr of the 2nd century and probably the greatest mind of his age, if not of the rabbinic period completely, who was himself perhaps a Jew by choice and was certainly illiterate till the age of 40, till he saw water running across a rock and wearing a groove. And he said, if water can wear a groove in that hard rock, then the words of Torah can work their way into my mind. And he went off to become this great scholar. Akiva goes in whole and comes out whole. Simeon ben Azai looked and died. Simeon ben Zoma went mad. Elisha ben Abuya, who is the anti-hero of As a Driven Leaf, went in and became Acher, something else. He became an apostate in such a way that it was forbidden to pronounce his name. So this world of Kabbalah is something you do not go into, how shall I put it, unprepared. And you always do it with a teacher, lest speculation start to take you off into uncharted waters. So read, yes, learn it, but very carefully, very slowly. And again, I was not raised learning it, so I can't speak more as an expert about the ins and outs or the different Sefirot and all their manifestations and what they mean. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, Ron?
We have just about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, I figured I had to. The question about anti-Semitism. God, I've taught whole courses just on the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism predates Christianity. The Greeks didn't know what to do with the Jews. They saw them as a race of philosophers, but they also denounced them as antisocial. They wouldn't worship with them. They wouldn't eat with them. They quoted the Jewish tradition that one does not marry outside the faith. Of course, someone who is a Jew by choice is a Jew in every respect, as much as somebody who is a born Jew. They saw the Jews' refusal to accept other gods as politically disloyal. You accepted the gods of your conqueror. In fact, they went so far as to accuse the Jews at times of that in the innermost sanctum in the temple, there was the head of a jackass. I don't know which politician they were, never mind. The Romans, Tacitus called the Jews lazy because they took off every 7th day. With the coming of other religions, The Jews are accused of being Christ killers. I heard that in my youth. In the middle, you had St. John Chrysostom, one of the anti-Nicene fathers, saying the Jews should be persecuted, driven out, their synagogues burned, the Jews physically attacked. That set a pattern for later on. In the Middle Ages, Jews were banned from owning land. They could not be farmers. They could not be members of the guilds that controlled all the trade production. Yes?
When was that they were banned?
In the Middle Ages. They were banned from the guilds. So what could they go into? They went into day labor or maybe artisan work, but within their own community. Or they went into being merchants or into money lending. But then they were accused of being greedy. I know as late as the late 19th century, and it may still be true in England today, to say you're in the hands of the Jews means you're in debt. Even when your creditor isn't Jewish. I see that, you see that expression at least once in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. And Agatha Christie was no better. She was rather nasty towards anybody who wasn't British. You had in the Middle Ages then Jews being accused of being money hungry and so on. They were accused of one desecrating the host, of actually breaking into churches and stabbing the wafers for the Eucharist and making them bleed. And they were accused of murdering non-Jews, particularly children, to use their blood for the matzah, the unleavened bread for Passover. That accusation, by the way, didn't stop with the Middle Ages. In 1840, it was leveled in Damascus when a priest mysteriously died and hundreds of Jews were killed in riots. It was leveled at a Jew in Russia, Mendel Bayless, in 1912. It showed up in the United States in the 1920s in Massena, New York. And it still shows up from time to time in the Middle Eastern press, where the Jews are accused of murdering non-Jews to use their blood, even though specifically you're not allowed to consume blood under any circumstances except a blood transfusion or if you cut your finger. Your own blood's okay. All right. You have any number of these things. In the Islamic world, they were considered dhimmi, second-class citizens. They had certain rights and they were protected, but they paid a tax for the privilege. And in fact, in the 1100s, a Jewish philosopher in Spain, Judah Halevi, wrote a book, The Kuzari, which is a retelling of a tale of how a major kingdom in the Crimean area, in the Black Sea area, the Khazars, converted to Judaism. We know that's a historical fact. Halevi portrayed how the king came to choose to be Jewish, and then they have a discussion of his understanding of Judaism, but the subtitle was In Defense of a Despised Faith. And when you get into the modern world, they're seen as an alien presence, even by people like that SOB, and I'm cleaning up my language, Richard Wagner, the opera composer, whose son-in-law, Euston Stewart Chamberlain, was one of the founders of Aryan race theory that ultimately led to the Holocaust. Jews have been accused of being the backers of capitalism and communism simultaneously. In Japan, when they went through a major economic downturn, I think it was in the 70s or early 80s, some people in Japan blamed the Jews, although there were about 5,000 Jews in Japan. When solidarity became a major threat to the communist government in Poland, they blamed the Jews of Poland, who number fewer than 10,000 out of a population in 1939 of 3 to 4 million, most of whom died in the Holocaust. Jews are accused of controlling the media, and so on. It really started in earnest in this country. There were always splashes of it, although George Washington wrote this beautiful letter to the Newport congregation. You know, the United States government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no existence. But in the post-Civil War era, Jews were banned from clubs. Jews were banned from hotels. They could not get into Ivy League schools. Brandeis University was started because the Jews couldn't get in to Ivy League schools. There were quotas. I myself was told by an interviewer that one of the reasons I wasn't going to get to go to Yale was because there were just too many Jewish kids from New York. So, and the interviewer was Jewish. We see it when the state of Israel is delegitimized. It's one thing to criticize it, it's another thing to say it has no right to exist. And many of the things, and that's the agenda in many cases. My synagogue in Hull was desecrated with swastikas 3 times in the past 4 years. There are the skinhead groups that are around. There are the various militias and so on. There's even a fringe group that attach themselves to Occupy Wall Street. You can find it online, where they're shouting anti-Semitic slogans about the Jews and the banks and so on. During the Holocaust, the United States State Department deliberately went out of its way to block the entry of refugees, until Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau went to Roosevelt and said, I've got a report on this, and you do something or I go public. The Holocaust, the people in the camps begged the Allies to bomb the railroads that led to the camps, to bomb the crematoria, and they said, our planes don't go there, and every night the planes were flying overhead. Read The Abandonment of the Jews by David Morse, or an earlier work, Henry Feingold's The Politics of Rescue. Okay, and if you want to read the 2 best one-volume histories of anti-Semitism that I know, one, and it's based on it was the companion volume for a PBS series called The Longest Hatred. There is a newer book out, but I don't remember the title or the author offhand, but Robert Wistrich, W-I-S-T-R-I-C-H, The Longest Hatred, and a book by a man whom I had the great privilege to know, and it's in a 2nd edition. It is called The Anguish of the Jews by Father Edward Flannery, who was from Rhode Island. If you can get the 1st edition, there's a fascinating part of the foreword, but it's probably the best short 1 volume. And he's writing it from a very neutral perspective, okay, as a priest. Wistrich as an academic. Anyway, I'm assuming I'm just about out of time. I'm a rabbi, that wouldn't normally stop me, but you have classes and other things to do. Any last-minute questions? Okay. Yes. The last 2 books? The Longest Hatred by Robert Wistrich and The Anguish of the Jews by Father Edward Flannery. If you have questions that do come up, Mrs. Sadler has my email address, rabbibenl@yahoo. Okay? And just write to me, and that's fine. Yes. Thank you.